The next talk is Category versus Semantic Violations in Prefix Attachment in Slovenian by Bojana Ristić, Karin Kavčič, Žaucer, Linnaea Stockall, and Christina Manouilidou. And Bojana Ristić will be presenting the paper.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Bojana, and I will be presenting our work on processing morphologically complex words in Slovenian. This is a joint work with my collaborators from University of Ljubljana, Karin Kavčič and Christina Manouilidou, University of Nova Gorica, Žaucer, and Linnaea Stockall from the Queen Mary University. So the important theoretical assumption that we will be relying on in this talk has to do with processing morphologically complex words, and more specifically, what happens after we compose them. So it has been proposed in this model from 1995 that after we decompose an complex affixed word, there are two stages that we go through, and one being the licensing stage, where we first check the subcategorization properties of the stem and affix and see whether they can be combined together. And then, once licensed, the compatibility, the semantic compatibility of these stem plus affix combinations is evaluated. Another stage called composition, or semantic composition. And indeed, there's the research line that provides some evidence for this distinction between these two stages in a series of behavioral studies in English, Greek, and Slovenian by Manouilidou and Stockall and colleagues. They developed a paradigm where they developed pseudo-words that either violate subcategorization properties or semantic, in this case, argument structure properties. So they would compare violations, pseudo-words, with violations such as paperable, where you add a suffix able to a noun, which cannot be licensed, to the pseudo-words such as dieable, where you add a suffix to a verb, which is okay, but the wrong type of verb, in this case intransitive. And they found that there is a difference in response, both in the RTs and in the accuracy, such that the violations such as dieable elicit longer response times and elicit more errors. There is also neuroimaging evidence for this distinction between these two stages. And the studies in Greek and English, the study in Greek is done with suffixes and in English with prefixes. They found that these two types of violations, reflecting these two different stages, can be distinguished both temporally and spatially. So in this study in English done by Stockall and colleagues, they found that category violations such as rehat, where you add a prefix to a noun, elicit more activation in the 200 to 300 millisecond time window in the temporal lobe than the semantic violations such as relaugh, where you add prefix to an intransitive verb, right? Whereas in the later time window, around 400 milliseconds, they found more activation for the semantic violations such as relaugh than for the category violations such as rehat, and this was in orbitofrontal cortex. The same pattern of results was also found for the Greek, in the study with the Greek suffixes. Now, the current experiment that I will be presenting continues this line of research and is actually part of a bigger project called Savant, that is a collaboration between several universities and research centers. And in this project, we want to see whether different languages that are unrelated and those that are related, such as BCS and Slovenian that I'm talking about today, whether they elicit similar processing patterns and similar brain responses. So we will be obtaining both behavioral and neuroimaging data using EEG and MEG. And the idea is that also using these under-investigated and different languages to get a better cross-linguistic comparison on the morphological rule processing, and also take advantage of the peculiarities of these different languages that have different morphological rules. And as I said, today I will be focusing on the Slovenian. This is what we have so far. So in Slovenian, we will be looking at whether we get the same processing pattern behaviorally that was observed in the previous studies, such that violations such as diable are take more to reject and elicit more errors when rejecting than category violations such as paperable. And we do this with Slovenian prefixes, which hasn't been done before, and which is interesting because it gives us an opportunity to look at this semantic well-formedness, semantic opposition stage, let's say more straightforwardly. Namely, the attachment rules of Slovenian prefixes can be said to follow a purely semantic constraint, as far as we understand, that we can call type of event, and then I will be talking about in a minute. So the previous studies that I mentioned used, in order to create pseudo words that violate semantic violations, they used argument structure violations. And as we know, argument structure phenomenon is, its status is not purely semantic, it's at least both semantics and syntax, depending on who you ask. But here, the restrictions will be relying more on semantics, allowing us to test whether violating these semantic rules will evoke the same processing responses in the previous studies in comparison to the category violations. So what about Slovenian prefixes and semantics? So Slovenian prefixes, when it comes to their subcategorization properties, they attach to verbs only or the verbal stems, but their attachment restrictions seem to follow, seem to be dictated by the semantics of the prefix and the semantics of the stem and the compatibility between the two. So for example, the prefixes od, raz, and uz that we will be focusing on today, although polysemous, as all South Slavic prefixes, they all seem to strongly resist attaching to the verbs that denote stable states or emotions. But what they like is attaching to actions and sometimes states or emotions, but those that can be abruptly changed, they can be reversed, or they can be intensified all of a sudden. So for example, od and raz, besides their directional meanings, both have this meaning of a reversal of an action, such as detach, odlepiti, or untie. Od also has the meaning of the completion of an action, whereas raz and uz both share this meaning of the intensification of a state, emotion, or an action, or an abrupt beginning of it. So although polysemous, they seem to have this overlapping meaning, overlapping semantics, that they resist attaching to stable states or emotions. So in order to create the semantic violations for this study, we added these three prefixes to such verbs, so the stable verbs that we determined by a norming. So we added prefixes od, raz, and uz to the group of the stable verbs such as feel, stable states such as feel, so we will get something like od čutiti, od feel, to create category violations, so pseudo words that violate subcategorization properties. We added these two prefixes to the bases that were nouns or adjectives, the group of nouns and adjectives, so we will get something like odd onion or odd terrible, which is really terrible in Slovenian. And following previous studies, we also had a group of grammatical items, so the existing verbs with these three prefixes, which is more of a control condition, and had three separate groups of these verbs, thus obtaining a 3x3 study design with these three conditions as levels of the condition factor and three different prefixes, just to check if there are any potential differences between the prefixes. We also added some fillers, non-words, and had three lists. So when we were creating pseudo words, which for semantic and category violation, we chose the basis following several criteria. We tried to match them on morphological complexity. Well, we managed to match them on morphological complexity, so all the bases are bimorphemic. The base frequency was matched, length, and the length of the entire pseudo words. However, we did not match the grammatical conditions on the whole word frequency, which I will talk about a little bit in the discussion. To determine these bases for these semantic violations, so these stable verbs, we created a list of the stable emotions or states based on the previous work, and we ran a rating with 30 native speakers of Slovenian to get rid of those that were rated as really unstable. And then when we created all the pseudo words and all the existing words, we ran a separate acceptability judgment task with 45 native speakers to get rid of those pseudo words that were rated really highly and those real words that were rated lowly. And then we ran the lexical decision task with 96 native speakers of Slovenian. This was ran online through Gorilla software, and participants were recruited through Prolific. And this was a lexical decision task that consisted of 2 blocks. We had around 240 items in total, preceded by practice block. We also did some language questionnaire. It took around 10 to 20 minutes to complete, and at each trial, people would see a fixation cross for 300 milliseconds, followed by the screen with the item. That was either a pseudo word or a word. It was randomized, of course, and the participants had 2 seconds to respond and to say whether the string that they see is an existing word of Slovenian or not, pressing left or right arrow, which was also counterbalanced for half of the participants. And then there was a blank screen that was randomized. Before doing the analysis, we did some data cleaning to get rid of those participants that had really low accuracy on filler items, got rid of some outliers and really short answers, and then fitted 2 different models, 2 separate models, one for accuracy and one for RTs, which was done only on the correct trials. And just to reiterate what our predictions were based on the previous data. So the predictions were that semantic violations would elicit lower accuracy and take more time to reject than the category violations. In other words, saying that odd feel is not a word is harder and elicits more errors than saying that odd onion is not a word. And to the results, I will first present the results for accuracy. We got the expected pattern of results. So for the 3 prefixes, we got the result that semantic violation elicited significantly a lower accuracy than category violations, and the peer comparison showed that this was significant for every prefix. When it comes to RTs, again, as expected, semantic violations were significantly slower to reject than category violations, and this was significant for every prefix. So we can conclude that both for accuracy and RTs, we obtained the same pattern of results as seen in the previous studies, but this time with Slovenian prefixes, meaning using a purely semantic constraint for the semantic violations rather than argument structure, which was used in the previous studies. This is very interesting given that, the semantic constraints and the rules that we used here are not, don't follow, let's say, a traditional classification of words, but a rather custom-made classification. And this provides new evidence and support for the distinction between the licensing stage and the semantic composition stage in complex word processing. Now, there's another thing that is not central to our research question, but I thought might be interesting to discuss. So as I said, the contrast between semantic violation and category violations was stable across prefixes. However, we did have the third condition, the grammatical items, which are the green bars here. And we did get a significant condition by prefix interaction, which was triggered by this prefix uz. And if you look at the green bar, in the last bar cluster, you can see that the existing words with uz got lower accuracy and took longer than for the other prefixes. And we think this might be because actually the frequency, the whole word frequency of these existing words with uz is lower than for other prefixes. Furthermore, you can also see that overall the pseudo words with uz were rejected faster and a little bit more accurate overall in rejecting them. So it seems that overall people like saying no to either pseudo words or existing words with us. And we think that this might come from the fact that us has a lower productivity in Slovenian than other prefixes. However, what is interesting here is that the relevant contrast, which is the contrast between the two violations, seems to be stable, even with this low productivity and lower frequency prefix. So it seems that these two factors, frequency, lower frequency and productivity, which we know are important factors in processing words, did not affect this relevant contrast, seemed not to affect this particular morphological rule processing. I would also like to add that, as I said, in this project, we are also investigating the within a subfamily contrasts, and the pattern of results we are obtaining for BCS, which is a very closely related South Slavic language, seems to be very, very similar. And we developed an experiment with a very similar design using the cognate prefixes, and the results seem to be almost the same, speaking to the universality of this morphological rule or prefix processing in South Slavic language family. We have also collected MEG data on both of these languages, which is yet to be analyzed. And if you would like to hear something about other languages from the project, for example, on Bangla, make sure to check out tomorrow's poster session, Shornendu's, I think it's poster number 32. And if you would like to hear about morphological rule processing in Tagalog, please stay where you are, because Dave will give a talk on Tagalog in several minutes. I would like to thank our funding sources and all the people who helped us collect data and deal with South Slavic corpora. And thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for questions from anyone in the room or from anyone in the Zoom room.
Hi, Volya Kapetsynski, University of Oregon. Really interesting results. I'm just wondering if you need the framework to explain them. So it would seem to me that category violations are also larger. You could think of them as larger semantic violations, or as kind of morphotactic violations, where you're seeing, not in English, because there are no overt morphemes, right, that distinguish the verb and noun roots in that case. But in your case, I mean, there's also suffixes that identify whether it's a verb or a noun, so they're overtly present. And I would think that you could also be faster at recognizing the violation, because there are sort of overt orthographic cues that you could use.
Yeah. Thank you. That's an interesting question. Yeah, indeed, for the semantic violations, we would always have a verb in the same form. And for the category violations, we would have either an adjective or a noun. So, and the contrast was present, whatever the base was. I agree. I think this is why it's interesting to look at different languages that we have on the project, because they will be using different kinds of violations, not just with verbs, but also in the nominal domain. So I agree. I think it's an open question still.
Yeah, I think it would be important to also look at semantic similarity in some way to see whether that you could control that across the categories.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Matt Husband, University of Oxford. I just wondered so you talked here about event type as the semantic correlate here, and so you've had this previous data on argument structure. Do you have a sense that these are actually still the same kind of thing and therefore related in a single stage, or do you think maybe one of them is either prioritized or different from other cases, and do you have any data on that, or data that's coming up that we should be expecting about that?
We haven't analyzed the neuroimaging data still. That's very interesting. I mean, it's also tricky because then we will be talking about a semantic violation in one language and argument structure violation in another language. I don't know. It seems that the argument structure violations that were obtained in the previous languages, well, actually, there was a study in Slovenian, but with suffixes, with argument structure violations. The results are honestly not so clear. The contrasts are not so striking as here. I think they used adjunctive suffixes. So still no data, still no neuroimaging data to show, but it seems that this semantic violations is arguably, I could say that maybe it's eliciting stronger response, a stronger contrast.
That's really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. I really love this talk. It's perhaps a bit vague, but I never know when and if I should draw a boundary between morphology and syntax. And so one reaction to this kind of results for me is always like, isn't this evidence for a two-stage model? Obviously, it perhaps would be stronger evidence if we were dealing with inflectional morphology. And so I wonder, could you think of an experiment using inflectional morphology that violates category and semantics?
Yeah, I can suggest to pay attention to Dave's talk that is coming up to my. Yeah, I agree. I can't speculate for Slovenian, honestly. But yeah, Dave will be talking about it a little bit, yes. Thank you, that's a very important point, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Other questions? Would you care to talk a little bit more about why things might be so organized, like why these selectional restrictions are enforced so early? I mean, you characterized it as licensing, but I wonder if it's part of the lexical access procedure.
Yeah. Well, this is so what we are claiming here is the distinction between these two stages. Now, with the behavioral data, right now I cannot talk about the temporal resolution, except for the temporal development of these two different kinds of effects, except from the previous studies. I don't know. There is something. We saw that with different types of with different stems, be it adjectives, and in the previous studies they also use adjectives and nouns. It seems that there is a very strong and early response to this category violations. Right now, this is all we know before looking at the neuroimaging data. I don't know how early it is. This is what I'm saying. Still.
Further questions? Anyone on the Zoom? Okay, well, please join me in thanking our speaker. Okay.